The root causes of inflation, I think, were not driven by private sector. The inflation that we're feeling now is a result of government intervention and probably some reckless spending. Coronavirus didn't cause our supply chain issues. Shutting down the economy did. And I think now what we're seeing is some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are trying to convince the American people that the only solution would be more government, and it's not going to work. Just last week, Congresswoman Schakowsky introduced the so-called Price Gouging Prevention Act. This bill, supported by some of my colleagues again on the other aisle, would make the FTC the arbiter of what constitutes unreasonable price increases. If this were to become law, companies, there would be no incentive for them to raise wages because they would be taken to court and be loaded up with many legal bills. So when prices are fixed too low and companies stop producing, which is what we saw during the 70s with the Arab oil embargo, can you just give us your thoughts or elaborate a little bit on policies such as price fixing that in this bill or in President Biden's recent quote-unquote plan to fight inflation, how it's not going to work or how it's poorly thought out?
Thank you, sir. It's so interesting that we're talking about price controls because they don't work on many levels. On a theoretical level, the idea of setting prices, which is likely to happen for the government to set prices below the market level, would obviously increase the demand, and supply would not keep up with it. That is exactly what we have now in terms of shortages when we look at baby formula, but we don't have, that's not what we want across the entire economy. You referenced it just now. Historically, we have seen price controls not work. We look back to President Nixon trying to control oil and gas prices. It's not economic. It's the idea that we can use technocrats, for example, can somehow determine the best prices across the country, across millions of products in our entire economy, across our entire nation, is a recipe for failure. And so when I see things like price controls showing up in pieces of legislation, they may be well-intended, but we've already seen historically the consequence that happens. And so as I mentioned, when we talk about what's driving inflation, we have not heard enough about demand. And demand, certainly supply has been shortened for many different reasons, but demand was inflated because Congress decided to give American households quite a lot of stimulus in lots of different forms, regardless of whether or not the realities really warranted them, particularly back in 2001. So we are now living with the consequences of that.
Yeah, very good. Just one other kind of secondary effect, I guess is the way I would describe it. We've just saw a double-digit increase in the price of farmland in my home state of Wisconsin. And obviously it's tied directly to the price of production, crops, and the yields that are affected by the cost of land. Can you talk a little bit about kind of that bigger picture on not only just farmland in Wisconsin, but automobiles and other major purchases that consumers may be looking at in the future?
Absolutely. So at Independent Women's Forum, we actually put together a price tracker that looks at some of the cost increases every month on things that American households are looking at and purchasing. Obviously, used cars are increasing. Everything from shoes to, the milk, and I buy lots of milk because I have 2 toddlers right now. But when you think about things like what goes into the production of those goods that get onto our shelves, I mean, the cost of fertilizer that feeds, that leads to produce or feeds cattle, for example. There's so many increases on the production side. And the producer price index certainly has hit almost a new high last month. Those costs are being, some of them are being borne by large companies and small companies, and they pass that on to consumers in the form of higher prices. So when we, so this, I worry when I hear about price gouging being the only reason why things like farmland or the cost of meat is rising, because there's so many other costs that I think a lot of companies are actually eating that don't get passed on, and some that get passed on. Labor costs are rising. And when we look at goods-producing companies as well as service-producing companies, we didn't see labor costs substantially rising in 2020. We did see them rising substantially in 2021 because of worker shortages. Well, why did we have worker shortages? Well, you know, there's plenty of stimulus going into American households that discouraged work. So lots of these factors are going into what's driving inflation, demand and supply.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.